Welcome to our discussion of the Progressive era in the first decades of the 20th century. So we're going to look basically 1901 to 1920. And before we look in detail at the situation in Texas, as in the last few lectures, I'd like to give you a general overview of the Progressive era in the United States. Now, the progressive reforms were promoted by middle-class idealists in both political parties. This was not a grassroots movement from the poor people, nor was it generated by the wealthy. And the basic goal of progressivism was to promote reform of social and economic institutions through laws and governmental regulation to ensure social justice. And what were they trying to eliminate? They were trying to eliminate child labor, the consumption of alcohol. They wanted to promote economic competition. They wanted to make the factories safer. And they also wanted to give women the right to vote. And there were some other reforms, one of which we'll talk about in Texas, was the desire to make the country more democratic through political reforms. Now, before 1900, people generally favored institutions other than the government to deal with those who were suffering from poverty or social issues. There were some exceptions, but generally people looked at institutions such as the churches, which often, when there were economic downturns, would provide donated food, would set up kitchens to provide hot soup, and churches, of course, still do that today. There was also charity from companies and individuals, which, of course, still continues today. And there were a number of voluntary organizations that started largely in the 1850s and 1860s. Some examples of those are the Salvation Army, and you've probably seen volunteers with the Salvation Army outside large stores in the December holiday season. So someone usually dressed up as Santa Claus, ringing a bell, and they have a bucket, and that money goes to poor people. You have the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, and the counterpart for women, the Young Women's Christian Association, the WYCA. When labor unions formed in the last few decades of the 19th century, they often provided assistance to members of the labor union who were sick or had a sick family member or someone who was injured on the job. And there are many, many other examples. Now what we're going to see is, because of the nature and the scope of the problem, many middle-class people favored continuing, of course, these non-governmental measures, but really placing the focus on action that the government could take, and at this time, particularly the federal government. Now, why progressivism around 1900? Well, there's several reasons. One was, since the Civil War, there'd been an increasing gap between the rich and the poor. And we saw how the era after the Civil War was often called the Gilded Age, because there were a number of extremely wealthy people, and people said the country was gilded and it had a golden covering because there was much suffering underneath that gold. There was industrialization, but as I underlined here, it was unregulated. There were virtually no regulations. And these would be regulations in the economic sphere, and also regulations to protect the workers in terms of number of hours, in terms of child labor, and safety measures we take for granted. There were new machines, there were there was virtually no protection for the workers. So if a worker accidentally turned the wrong way, his arm or her arm could be caught up in a machine and the arm could be sliced off. There was no regulation either of food. So particularly in the making of sausage and the processing of meats, people around 1900 on a per capita basis ate much more meat than is the case today, particularly beef or pork, and sausage, of course, was a combination. And there were horrific accounts, most famous of which is Upton Sinclair's famous novel, The Jungle. When people read that, they were literally sick. To read that dead rats that had been killed with rat poison, were just picked up from the floor and thrown in the big blender that was making sausage. And that led, of course, to legislation such as the 1906 Pure Food Laws and the formation of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, which we still have to regulate the safety of food. And the FDA, of course, also looks at the safety and efficacy of medicines. We saw urbanization. There was much less in Texas, as we'll see, but there was some urbanization in Texas. And this was largely unplanned. People just moved to the city. That's where the jobs were. Particularly the immigrants went to the cities because that's where their family or friends were who had written home to say, you must come here. You can get a much better job at home. You have all these people moving into small geographic area, and it caused all sorts of problems, as you can imagine. There was also, in religious terms, what was called the social gospel movement, and this was among Protestants, white Protestants, middle-class Protestants, many of whom said, we need to look at the teachings of the Gospels of Christ, and we need to put them in action here on earth and not just go to church and pray. And this, of course, led to a number of voluntary associations that were church-related, such as the YMCA that I just mentioned, and the Salvation Army. Actually, both of those organizations were first established in Britain, and then a few years later, they started in the United States. Also, in terms of thinking, Charles Darwin wrote his famous book on evolution, The Origin of Species, in 1859, and it had a profound impact throughout the world. And in the United States, as in Western Europe, many of the wealthy people at first said, well, the reason we're wealthy is why? Well, we're animals, we human beings, we are, and it's social Darwinism. Society works like the animal kingdom, and we, the wealthy, are wealthy not because we're bad, because we are more fit. It's the evolution, the process of evolution in the economic sphere. And so we really shouldn't do anything for the poor, because if we help the poor, we are disturbing the natural process of Darwinian evolution in the economic sphere. Well, that was increasingly rejected by more and more people, and certainly by the progressives, who said, no, that is not the case. We have to take efforts to help your workers, to help the poor, those who are mentally ill or whatever. And another major source of progressivism were journalists. Journalists working for newspapers, which were widely read at the time, who would go out and themselves see what was happening. Some of them actually went out with the recently invented camera to take photographs, because, as we all say, a photograph is worth 1,000 words. And they would take pictures of poor people. They would write articles on all the horrific conditions. And these are what today we call investigative journalists. At the time, they were called muck raking journalists, or muck rakers. And I'll show you on the next slide why they're called that. Okay, this is a drawing from the time. And the person holding the flashlight and the rake is a muck raking journalist. Muck, M-U-C-K, you may not be familiar with the word. It means, dirt and slimy liquid. For instance, if you leave a jar of some kind of food too long in the refrigerator, like a year or two, and you open it up at the bottom, it might be muck. And that, in the progressive sense, is referring to all the bad things happening in society. And there is a journalist using his or her rake, because we're female journalists, and the light of journalism to expose this and make people aware. And I can't overemphasize the impact of these journalists, because people generally were not aware of many of these conditions until they read about them in the newspapers or some of the early magazines that were appearing. Now, it's important to note that the progressives were not revolutionaries. Neither the journalists nor the public that considered themselves progressive. They weren't revolutionaries in the sense that they wanted to destroy capitalism, the capitalist system of life. To the contrary, they wanted to improve it, they wanted to reform it, and regulate it. And I mention this because there were some revolutionaries at this time and previously. Some had come over from Eastern Europe, such as the anarchists, who would go out and throw bombs during strikes and call for a revolution. But the progressive movement in the U.S. was not a revolutionary movement. And the next point I put in red with 2 stars. The central point of the progressive movement was that the government must be more active. And this really focused now on the federal government. The previous 15 or 20 years, in the 1880s and 1890s, there had been a number of reforms in local governments and city governments and state governments. And now that continued, but the focus really shifted to the national or federal government. The progressives very much considered themselves modern in the sense that they were scientific. They were going to have experts get together to investigate a problem, come up with possible solutions. And then they wanted to educate others, particularly using journalists, and then pass legislation or government regulations to deal with the problem. Now, President Theodore Roosevelt, who was affectionately called at the time Teddy Roosevelt, was really the first activist president in the United States, and he was in the forefront of the early progressives. He was very, very dynamic. In fact, he was often called a steam engine in pants. And when he became president, he wanted what he called his square deal. He wanted greater government control of companies. He wanted to conserve the environment. He started setting up the first national parks. He was not interested more broadly in what we call the environment today. He and other conservationists at the time wanted to focus on conservation of wild areas, such as Yellowstone Park in Wyoming, places like that. They didn't even focus on toxic waste coming out of factories and dumping into rivers or horrific smoke conditions in cities. Rather, they focused mainly on nature in the West. And the third major element was to protect consumers against contaminated food and medicine. And I mentioned this a few minutes ago. And all three of these actions required legislation or regulation by the federal government. This is one of the iconic photos of Teddy Roosevelt, a hearty laugh. He was from a very wealthy family, a very, very wealthy family. He had been a quite sickly boy, had studied at home. He used to lift weights and things to try and put on some muscles. And he was a good student and all, but then he took 2 years off after college and went off to the West and worked as a real-life cowboy. I mean, he actually lived with the cowboys, rode with them for 2 years. So for many, many in the United States, he was viewed as the rugged individualist. Many wealthy people thought he was a traitor to his social and economic class because he was pushing all those reforms. And let's look quickly at some of the major goals of the progressive era in the United States. And of course, we'll see much of this in Texas. Women's suffrage, giving women the right to vote, became a major goal. And it's interesting, between 1880 and 1910, during that 30-year period, the number of women employed outside of the house tripled from about 3 to 8 million women. So women were becoming more engaged in what traditionally had been, quote, men's jobs. And after the Civil War, the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was adopted, which you'll recall gave black men the right to vote, but not women, neither white nor black women. And at that time, most men genuinely believed that women should not go into politics because politics was a very corrupt activity in which bargains were struck, and they were worried that that would corrupt women's moral purity. And I must add that some women agreed. It's not entirely clear how many, because there weren't public opinion polls on everything like there is today. But some women, particularly in the 1860s, would have agreed that a woman's place was in the home, raising the children, making a good home, and not out in the corrupt world of politics. Now, from 1869, a few years after the Civil War, until 1914, women could vote, but only in the western states, most of the western states. This did not generally include Texas. Black women were not involved in this movement, either as participants, or the goal wasn't to give black women the vote. The goal was more to give white women the vote. So we'll talk about in a minute, blacks were generally not included in any of the progressive reforms, except to the extent that they benefited from things like the end of child labor. And the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was, of course, adopted shortly after World War II in 1920, giving women the right to vote. And it's interesting, in the very first election in which women had the right to vote, the 1920 election, women were 40% of the voters. Now, this is a map showing at what time, what date women achieved the right to vote. And you can see Texas is included, that by 1914, women didn't have complete right to vote. They could vote in some elections, but not more generally. The darker green were previous to that date, and you can see states like Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado gave women full suffrage as far back as the 1880s and 1890s. This is a cartoon at the time, political cartoon entitled The Awakening. This obviously is in favor of women's suffrage. And you have a woman with a torch of liberty, and she's walking from the western states into the eastern states, which includes Texas, And the women you can see in those states are reaching out. Yes, yes, we want that torch of liberty and right to vote. Here are just a few photos from the time showing women's efforts to publicize their right to vote. This is a sign of, it says, welcome suffrage envoys. People would travel from major city to major city, women would, and these were generally wealthy women. They weren't working. Their husbands were wealthy. They were bankers or lawyers or businessmen, and the women would go off by themselves, and they would engage in this activity. If you've ever seen the old British movie Mary Poppins, you recall the what was it? Mary Poppins was a nanny, and what was it? She worked for Mr. and Mrs. Banks, and the movie took place in London, but you can see Mrs. Banks going off to women's suffrage parades in London, and her husband's a very wealthy banker, and he sort of goes, "Oh, tut tut, that's fine. That's your hobby or something." Couldn't have cared less about the cause, but she obviously did. This is a very colorful photo of women driving around. You notice there's a woman driving, and campaigning for votes for women. This photo, I think, is interesting. The driver is a man, and the women, again, they're very wealthy, upper-class women, are trying to publicize the need for women to vote. This is a parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913. Now, as I mentioned, some women were still opposed to acquiring the right to vote, and many men were. And this is the headquarters of the National Association opposed to women's suffrage. The name of the organization says it all, and these are men outside, obviously, reading about what they considered the terrible news that women were advocating the right to vote. So apart from the right to vote or suffrage, women really, really advocated the prohibition of alcohol. And this was, again, like suffrage, spearheaded by middle-class, educated women. And they viewed alcohol as a real threat to the family and social progress in general for the entire country. There were a number of organizations set up. I won't go through them all, but one of the most famous was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and WCTU. And this at first advocated only temperance, which meant temper or limit the consumption of alcohol. So the thought was, well, if we can just get the men to have one beer or one glass of whiskey, we'll be fine. But then very shortly, after a few years, they decided that approach would not work, and so they turned to total prohibition. And you notice the title of the organization, or the name of the organization, includes the word Christian. This is their seal. This is one of my favorite photos from the time. These women, who all look quite serious in the photo, are saying, "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours." And many women would carry signs like that and parade around the cities. And one of the major organizations, in addition to the WCTU, was the AntiSaloon League. Saloon is a bar. Of course, it was men only. Often there were prostitutes there. Often there was gambling. And so men would go to the saloons. Not all, but some men would have far too much to drink, or they had just been paid. They'd walk into the saloon and say, "Oh, drinks are on me, everyone," and, spend most of his paycheck buying drinks for everybody in the bar, or spending the money on the prostitutes there, or losing much or all of the paycheck at the gambling tables. So the Anti-Saloon League was set up to close the saloons. And part of it, of course, was to reduce the consumption of alcohol, but the saloons were really viewed as dens of evil. So a number of wealthy, educated women married to very wealthy men in the communities went into these saloons with axes, and they broke the liquor bottles, and behind the bars there were these beautiful mirrors, very elaborate mirrors, and they throw their axe or hatchet and break the mirror, and the men would just stand there and look, because at that, it was not considered correct for a man to physically restrain a woman who was doing something like that. And these were also the wives of very prominent businessmen or doctors or someone. And another reason they attacked the mirrors is often on the mirror there was a painting of a nude woman, and they thought that was immoral, so they broke these very, very elaborate mirrors. And I have a photo of one in a few minutes. By far the most famous of the women who ran around the country with axes attacking the saloons or bars was Kerry Nation, who actually started her crusade here in Houston. And the first bar that she and a couple other women went in and destroyed was later renamed the Carnation Bar in her honor, because these women wore carnation flowers oftentimes to symbol, because they're white, and that was a symbol of moral purity of the women who were there for moral reasons to destroy the bars. Here's a photograph of Kerry Nation. She doesn't look very friendly, does she? She has the Bible open, and she's carrying a hatchet. This is a political cartoon at the time after she had just gone into a bar. And you can see she had destroyed the mirror. And you can see next to the mirror there was a painting of a nude lady. And she had just gone and destroyed the bottles of whiskey. And the men don't know what quite to do. They're all horrified, and they're not going to go out and throw her to the ground. Well, as promised, this is a photo of an actual bar in the state of Kansas that Kerry Nation and a few other ladies went in and attacked. You can see the very elaborate mirror, which was very expensive for the bar to have, and, destroyed many, but not all, of the whiskey bottles. Well, in 1917, after many decades of particularly women lobbying for prohibition, Congress did approve prohibition in a law called the Volstead Act. And the Volstead Act was passed, and it gave a 1-year grace period before prohibition came into effect. And later there was a constitutional amendment to the U.S. Constitution. I might note there was no legal need for an amendment to implement prohibition, because, of course, there's absolutely nothing in the text of the U.S. Constitution that mentions prohibition. It's not as if the Constitution says, and the people have the right to drink alcohol. The Constitution is silent on that topic. But on this and many other controversial issues, supporters like to see their position codified in an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But the Volstead Act was sufficient. And of course, when prohibition was lifted in the early 1930s, not only was the Volstead Act repealed, but it was necessary to have another amendment to the U.S. Constitution to repeal the 19th Amendment. And that's interesting because 2 of the amendments to the U.S. Constitution deal with alcohol, and there have been only 18 amendments in total. Yes, 18 amendments in total to the Constitution since the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, was adopted a few years after the Constitution itself was adopted. So, and of course now many people want whatever their favorite issue is made into a constitutional amendment, whether it's the controversial issues like gay marriage, abortion rights, etc., etc. So this is a photo. In the next lecture, we'll talk about the 1920s, but this is a photo of federal agents destroying barrels of beer by pouring them into the sewer system. And we'll talk a little more in the next lecture that prohibition in the cities was a failure because of the many tens of thousands of illegal bars or speakeasies that were set up. Although prohibition was generally respected in the small towns and farming communities, but in the cities, most of the large cities had rampant corruption, and the police departments were bought out by the the corruption from alcohol interests. But we'll talk more about that in the next class. Okay, so we've looked at prohibition of alcohol, women's suffrage, and there were many other reforms such as eliminating child labor, shortening the number of hours, safety in the factories, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into all of them here. This is just an introduction to the major issues that impact Texas. Another area, though, was making the United States democracy more democratic. And so during this period of time, there was a much progressives focused on having direct election of U.S. senators. You will recall the Constitution set up a system where U.S. senators, of which, of course, there are 2 from each state, were not elected by the people, but rather were appointed by the state legislature. Each state legislature, for instance, in Texas, the Texas legislature would decide which 2 people would go to Washington to be the U.S. senators. And many people thought, well, that was not terribly democratic. The people had no say, other than the fact that they had voted for the politicians in the state capital, in our case, Austin, and they wanted to have direct election of U.S. senators. So an amendment to the U.S. Constitution was passed, and this was necessary because it had to change the actual wording of the U.S. Constitution to allow for direct election of U.S. senators, which of course we have today. But for over half of the history of the United States, U.S. senators were not directly elected. Other political reforms involved setting up initiative, referendum, and recall. All of these were provisions that allowed, for instance, once you get a certain number of people to sign a petition, that the issue must be considered in the next election. A referendum is asking for a special election on a specific issue, and recall is when you get a certain number of people to sign a petition, and then this is to recall a politician from office before the next election. And all 3 of these are particularly used in the state of California, but they're used throughout the United States, and some of them in the state of Texas. And one major reform in the political area was setting up primaries in each of the political parties to choose candidates. Previously, the most influential people in the political parties would get together in a party convention and decide who was going to be their candidate. Well, the average person did not have the time to do that because they had a job. They could not travel, for instance, in the state of Texas to Austin to attend a 3 or 4 day convention. And so the feeling was that there should be a primary election. Of course, we have this system today where members of either the Republican or Democratic Party can select among a list of names the person they want to be the candidate. And this reform, which we'll look at in more detail in a few minutes in Texas, was particularly important in a state like Texas, which had only one dominant party. And at the time we're talking about, in the early 1900s, by far the most dominant party in Texas was the Democratic Party. We've already seen that. So whoever was selected as a Democratic candidate to be a U.S. representative, a U.S. senator, governor, or whatever, would automatically fulfill that position because the Republican candidate would simply not be elected. And on the issue of race, President Teddy Roosevelt and virtually all the other white progressives had a major blind spot, or you could call it just simple racism. They did not consider how to improve the lot of people of other races. They didn't look at the black people in particular. I mean, blacks would benefit as part of the general population, for instance, when child labor was eliminated or factory hours were reduced, et cetera, et cetera. But there was no special program to focus on blacks, and particularly with increased segregation in the South. Nor did it include the Indians and some immigrant groups that were really discriminated against. And at this time, we're talking about the Catholics. Now let's shift our gears and focus exclusively on Texas. I've looked in some detail at the progressive movement, but now you'll understand how it fits in with Texas. Well, in the last 15 or 20 years of the 19th century, Texas had already taken some action that was considered very progressive. For instance, in 1889, the Texas legislature passed antitrust legislation to limit large corporations that were interfering with competition in the marketplace. And this was 1 year before the U.S. Congress passed the famous Sherman Antitrust Act. From the 12-year period from 1891 to 1903, three consecutive Texas governors, Hogg, Culbertson, and Sayers, were all very progressive. And that largely is due to the influence of Edward House, who was their main political advisor. And we'll see Mr. House again shortly because he became President Woodrow Wilson's main advisor. And in the 1890s, the state of Texas began serious regulation of the railroads as well as the insurance industries. Well, starting off the 20th century, Galveston experienced a horrific Category 4 hurricane, which killed more than 6,000 residents. There were about 30 to 35,000 residents in Galveston, so a significant percentage of them died. The entire city was covered by 5 feet of water. So I'm sure you've been to Galveston. It's a low-lying island, and it was just covered with 5 feet of water. So the only way to survive was to do what? Well, to go up on top of a building, or, if you have a 2-story house, you go upstairs. But the problem is many of those homes were just completely destroyed. To this very day, it remains the most devastating natural disaster in American history. And until the day of the hurricane, Galveston had been the largest city in the state, and it had been the most important port in Texas for exports of cotton and everything else. And following the hurricane, the major port became Houston. A ship channel was made. They had to dredge, the bottom to make sure the inlet for ships was deep enough. So you have the Houston ship channel. It goes up into Houston. While Houston can certainly be affected by hurricanes, as we all saw with Hurricane Harvey and others, it wasn't right on the coast, unexposed. And so immediately following the hurricane in Galveston, martial law was declared to prevent people from stealing what it was ever left, and a massive cleanup followed. They constructed a new 6-mile seawall, which was 17 or 18 feet high. It's still there, of concrete. And then the entire city was elevated. In some places, 17 or 18 feet of sand were added to the level of the city to bring it up to the top of the seawall. And this is at a time when they didn't have our modern, Caterpillar tractors and everything else. They did have they had steam engines, and so they got the sand by running large pipes out into the offshore, pumping up sand from the bottom of the ocean and just filling in. It was a tremendous effort. The houses that weren't destroyed, that people decided they wanted to keep, they were elevated. They just physically elevated the buildings and houses. There's a short 5 or 6 minute video from a news station in Canvas, and it explains the process of rebuilding Galveston. It has some great photographs of the damage. This is just one. This is one of the most famous photographs of a house sort of flipped at a 45-degree angle. But many, many other houses were totally destroyed because people's homes were built of wood, and they were totally destroyed. There was a large orphanage there, St. Mary's, right on the coast, with where 90 nuns and orphans were found drowned. It was very, very tragic. Well, the hurricane led to a progressive advance in municipal or city government. The city set up a new form of government called a city commission government, and at first the commissioners were appointed by the governor, and then later it changed where the commissioners were appointed by an elected mayor and an elected city council. And the idea was, this is very much in the progressive spirit, we're going to get experts, scientific experts in. So each commissioner was responsible for a single city function. You have a police commissioner, a fire, water, sanitation to deal with the many issues, etc., etc. And this was going to be expert and scientifically managed administration of the city. And as I mentioned, the commissioners were, within a few years, actually appointed by locally elected mayors and city councils. And the state legislature in Austin approved this, thought it was a great idea. Hundreds of cities in Texas adopted this same system of government, and it was also adopted in some other states. In the far north of Texas, in the city of Amarillo in 1912, they introduced yet a new form of city government called the city manager method, where the mayor and the city council, who are directly elected, handle the legislative functions of the city government. For instance, writing ordinances and making decisions, but the city manager was hired to administer the daily affairs of the city. It's somewhat similar to the commission system in that the manager would then be in overall charge of making sure, the water system's working, or the police, the fire, all the other essential functions of any city anywhere in the world. We spoke a few minutes ago about, in the national context, setting up political primaries. And this was so important in Texas because the Democratic Party was so dominant. And in 1905, Texas set up primary elections for each of the parties. And then that was further developed. 1918, they added a runoff election between the top two candidates in the primary election. And of course, this is what we have today. So let's say there are 10 candidates running to be the Republican or Democratic candidate, let's say for governor. The one with the most votes does not automatically become, if the person doesn't have more than 50% of the votes. So they'd take the top two, and then they'd have another election to decide who was the actual candidate. Now, looking a little more at women in Texas, you had the Women's Christian Temperance Union, we already discussed, set up in Texas. Women very active here to promote prohibition of alcohol. And then you had the Texas Equal Suffrage Association was formed to urge voting rights for Texas women. Now, Black and Mexican American women were not included in these groups, and so they set up their own federations. And here we see some suffrage activists at the state capitol. And this is in 1913. Okay, looking briefly at the economy. The economy remained essentially the same, with cotton and cattle exports continuing to dominate economic activities in the state. And politically, Texas remained very much a conservative southern state and genuinely approved the progressive movement in general and most progressive reforms, although there were some in Texas. The rapid buildup of the cities in the 1890s led to increased state laws and practices to segregate the races. This had not been such a priority for white Texans when the blacks were living out on small farms, but when they started moving into cities, many whites decided that they needed to segregate the races. At the same time, a greater effort was made to prevent the blacks from voting. Now, Texas is well known now as an oil state. If you were to ask most people outside of Texas or around the world, what is Texas? Well, they'd say a cowboy or an oil well, right? And the first major oil strike, it wasn't the first discovery of oil, was near Beaumont, just east of Houston, at Spindletop. And this was a tremendous oil field, and it really started the boom of oil in Texas. And of course, at the same time, there was more demand for petroleum-based products because you had cars powered by internal combustion engines that needed gasoline, and you had trucks that needed diesel, another product of the crude oil. And this led to huge growth in the population and the economy in East Texas. However, there were so many wells drilled in that general area, it depleted the fields. And by 1909, Texas was only the sixth largest oil-producing state in the country. But that will change, as we'll see, starting in the 1920s, when major oil fields are discovered in North and West Texas. This is a photo at the time of the gusher. It was called a gusher because when the drilling pipe went down and hit the oil, so much came up, it went up several hundred feet, and actually took several days to control the flow. Now let's look briefly at the growth of cities. In 1890, there were no Texas cities with more than 40,000 residents. However, 30 years later, in 1920, there were 4 cities with more than 100,000. This would be Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and San Antonio. They all had more than 100,000. So, and this is the same thing throughout the United States during this whole period of time, rapid urbanization. And Houston's growth was particularly impacted by the huge port in Houston. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there was a ship channel dug to reach the port of Houston, and this was financed by both the state government and the federal government. And in fact, they still have ongoing efforts. You could go off and look out, around the Houston Ship Channel today. Well, not every day, but many days. They have big boats there, what are called dredges, and they go down and they're scooping up the mud from the bottom of the ship channel, and they blow it out and put it on the side, because as the Buffalo Bayou flows into around the port of Houston, it's carrying silt and mud, and that all settles to the bottom. So I think it's a never-ending process. And the port of Houston at this time, we're talking about now, started to export not only cotton products, some beef, but mainly now it's moving more and more to oil. We'll look for a moment at immigration. Well, during the Progressive era, there was a tremendous flood of Mexican immigrants, and that was largely caused by the revolution in Mexico, which started around 1910. And many of the battles of that revolution were fought in northern Mexico, so it's quite understandable people were seeking refuge in Texas. And many of these people came over, they started working either in the cities or as laborers on farms. They didn't work generally as tenant farmers, but rather they worked for wages on farms. And indeed, by the 1920s, the number of Texas residents of Mexican origin had reached 10% of the population of the state, which is more than the number of blacks in the state. And it's continued growing at a faster rate ever since then. And the Mexican Americans, as seems natural, wherever they were living, they organized churches with Spanish language religious services, mutual aid societies. They set up some Spanish language newspapers, and they started to organize politically. Now, while there was segregation against Hispanics, Hispanics is the term we use now. Previously, they were called Mexicans because they were virtually all from Mexico, or Mexican Americans. They were certainly not as rigidly separated as blacks. And that said, they often lived in separate social communities, but they did interact more than blacks with the Anglos in work and politics. Now let's turn for a few minutes to the politics of the progressive movement in Texas. Well, Thomas Campbell was elected governor in 1906, and he was a progressive Democrat. And he expanded many of Governor Hogg's reforms dealing with economic regulation and particularly supporting public education. Campbell initiated banking reforms, and he also started legislation to end the system whereby prisoners were leased out to private companies and would receive no compensation. And the progressive movement to prohibit alcohol continued, and those who favored prohibition of alcohol were called dries, and those who favored continued consumption of alcohol were called wets. And they wanted to eliminate alcohol through the prohibition on its manufacture, sale, and consumption. And I might note the constitutional amendment on prohibition does not explicitly prohibit the consumption of alcohol, but only the manufacture, distribution, and sale of alcohol. So under the terms of the constitutional amendment, it was totally legal in the 1920s to consume alcohol, and many people did so at home by making their own alcohol, particularly gin, which has a high alcoholic content. And you could go to any supermarket and buy a little kit in a bag with all the ingredients to make gin. People tended to make it. They didn't have a lot of containers, so they'd clean their bathtub and make it, and then pour it into containers to drink. So bathtub gin is what it was called. Now, U.S. Senator Joseph Bailey was a conservative Democrat. He did not favor any of the progressive reforms. And his criticisms of progressives is often called Baileyism. And this had much attraction for many Texans and lasted for many, many decades after this. Now, in terms of racial relations, all the Democrats generally, both the conservatives and the progressives, supported white supremacy. And in 1911, the state legislature passed an amendment to the Texas Constitution to prohibit the manufacture and sale of alcohol, but that was defeated by a narrow margin in an election. Okay, turning to the national stage in 1912, a Democratic candidate was elected president. This is Woodrow Wilson, and he was the first Southern Democrat since the Civil War, and he worked very, very closely with Texans. So under Woodrow Wilson's administration, Texas became much more important politically within the Democratic Party, and that continued for much of the 20th century. And of course, President Lyndon Baines Johnson was a Texan. Now, President Wilson appointed many Texans to his cabinet or senior advisors. Just a couple examples. Burleson became Postmaster General. This was at a time when the U.S. Post Office was by far the major employer of the federal government, and the Postal Service played a vital role in the economy. David Houston became the Secretary of Agriculture, and Thomas Gregory was the Attorney General of the United States. And it's very significant that Wilson's chief personal advisor, he had no official position, but he traveled everywhere with Wilson. He was his main advisor, was the same Edward House, who had been the main advisor to a number of Texas governors. The two U.S. senators from Texas, both Shepard and Culberson, were very strong Wilson supporters, so this increased the importance of Texas in the Democratic Party. Now we're going to briefly talk about a phenomenon called Fergusism. It's hard to pronounce, Fergusonism. Jim Ferguson won the governor's race in 1914, and he claimed he was a Hogg progressive Democrat. You'll recall Governor Hogg had been very progressive. And Ferguson campaigned that he was speaking for the poor farmers that nobody seemed to care about in the progressive movement. And he strongly opposed prohibition. But he realized there were a lot of people who favored prohibition, so he tried to turn the attention away from the issue of prohibition by talking about the real economic distress of sharecroppers and tenant farmers, of whom there were many, many whites. We looked at sharecroppers and tenant farmers in another lecture, but certainly not all of them were blacks. There were many, many whites. And Jim Ferguson, became known as Farmer Jim, and he would go out and meet people all over the place in rural areas, and he'd say, tomorrow at noon I'll be at such and such an intersection of two roads. Please come and meet me. Well, Ferguson won a major victory, and that now shut the conservatives out of state politics for quite a long time. He particularly targeted university officials who criticized them, and these were officials from state-funded universities. He took it very personally that they shouldn't be attacking the governor of the state, and then he made some attacks on the university which were interpreted as attacking the independence and academic integrity of the university. Well, 2 years later, in 1916, Ferguson ran again to be governor for re-election, and he defeated in the primary the Democratic challenger Charles Morris. And Morris was a prohibitionist, and but Ferguson won the primary and he became re-elected. However, during the primary election, Charles Morris accused Ferguson of financial corruption and said that he was profiting off of loans from and had misappropriated state funds. Well, once reelected, Ferguson vetoed the legislature's appropriation of funding for the University of Texas, and that led to an outcry among the many people who supported UT. Prohibitionists didn't like Ferguson anyway, and many got together to oppose him. And indeed, Travis County, which is a county in which Austin is located, Travis County prosecutors went to a grand jury which indicted Ferguson for embezzlement and misuse of public funds. Well, a special session of the legislature was called. Technically, the governor has to do this, and Ferguson was not going to call the legislature in special session to remove him from office. But he finally agreed that there could be a special session of the legislature, and they voted to impeach Ferguson for misuse of public funds and corruption. And after he was impeached, the Texas Senate found him guilty on 10 charges, removed him from the office, and then took the additional step of disqualifying him from holding any future public office in the state of Texas. Well, when this happened and Ferguson stepped down, the lieutenant governor automatically became governor. He completed Ferguson's term of office. But Ferguson and his wife would come back into politics, and in fact his wife, Ma Ferguson, became governor in the 1920s, and we'll talk about her in the next lecture. So here we have Ma Ferguson. Okay. Now let's turn briefly at the conclusion here to World War I. As you recall from your other studies, World War I began in Western Europe in August of 1914. A dispute among the alliances, two major alliances of countries in Western Europe. However, President Wilson did not want to join. He saw no real U.S. interest at first. And this is also very reflective of the general feeling of isolationism in the U.S. that goes way back to President George Washington's farewell address, in which he cautioned Americans not to get involved in foreign conflicts that do not directly affect the United States. And we'll see exactly the same arguments advanced and account for the late U.S. entry into World War II. So Americans were watching the war in general, but public sentiment was certainly against sending American soldiers to Europe. Well, almost 3 years after the war broke out, there were some incidents, such as the sinking of the British passenger ship, the Lusitania, you may recall, in which over 100 Americans as passengers died, but the U.S. did not go to war over that. Then in February 1917, President Wilson actually broke diplomatic relations with Germany when Germany said it was going to have unrestricted submarine warfare. That meant the German submarines, which were very effective in the Atlantic, were just going to sink any ship they wanted to. And even though the United States was neutral, that meant that U.S. ships could be sunk. And of course, the Germans were interested in this because the United States was supplying Britain and France with huge shipments of weapons as well as food. Well, 3 weeks after Germany's announcement of unrestricted submarine warfare, a German official named Arthur Zimmermann sent a telegram or a message to the German embassy in Mexico City, urging Mexico to invade the United States. Basically said, once the state of war exists between the U.S. and Germany, I invite Germany. I invite Mexico to join Germany in fighting the United States. And once we in Germany defeat the United States, we promise to give Mexico its lost territory that the United States took. And this includes the states of New Mexico, Arizona, and of course, Texas. And then the telegram goes on to ask the Mexican government to contact the Japanese government and to get them involved. And the Japanese government would get the state of California. This is an actual copy of the telegram sent from Germany to Mexico. And it's interesting, you see Western Union telegram. Well, there wasn't much international radio communication at this period. It was virtually non-existent. So this was sent via telegram through a cable under the ocean, and it went from Germany to London to the United States. And then you can see at the top it says it went down from telegraph station to telegraph station. It went to Galveston, Texas, and then it's directed to the German legation. That means the German embassy in Mexico City. Now, a glance at it, you can see it's in code, so nobody can read it unless they can decrypt it. Well, what happened was, as this was relayed by Western Union, a commercial company, the British government intelligence services had intercepted this in London, and their code breakers had broken the code, and they realized how politically important this was, and so they immediately sent it to the President of the United States, who made it public, and the British wanted the United States very much. They wanted the United States to come into the war, and they hoped that this telegram would convince the United States government and the American people that they needed to enter World War I. And it's very interesting. Obviously, it was a very secret operation to break the code on this, and the British didn't want anyone to know they'd done this. So it was agreed with the United States that the United States would say that it received the telegram, the text of the telegram, the decoded text of the telegram, from a spy in Mexico City who had gotten it from the German embassy in Mexico City. And for that very reason, the British could continue to read intercepts from Germany, because obviously if the Germans knew that the British or the Americans were breaking their codes, they'd immediately change their codes. So, well, there was an immediate reaction in the United States, horrified that Germany wanted to carve up the United States. And here you can see a famous political cartoon. You have a knife, and the man holding the knife is the Tsar, the leader of Germany, and you can see his right hand taking the knife. And on the map of the United States, he has "for myself," that's for Germany. And then it says "for Mexico," that's for Arizona, that's Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. Those states will go to Mexico. And then the Tsar has California for Japan, ? Well, that's because Japan had not yet, joined, and so Germany. And so the hope was, by offering Japan the prospect of taking over California, Japan could be encouraged to enter the war. Well, this is the headline of the New York Times. Germany seeks an alliance against the U.S., asks Japan and Mexico to join her. Full text of her proposal made public. These are huge, huge headlines in the New York Times. Well, you recall we talked earlier about there were a lot of Germans in Texas. Germans who come over many years before, loyal American citizens, but there was a large German-American population. And also Texas had a lot of revolutionary violence still on the border with Mexico caused by the Mexican Revolution. So most Texans wanted to support fighting Germany in this war. They certainly didn't want Mexico to get involved with Germany. So there was a tremendous turnout by Mexican men to fight. 1 million Texas men immediately registered for the draft, the selective service system, and about 200,000 volunteered for service, mainly in the Army. This is one of my favorite military recruiting posters. This is from World War I, and this is put out by the U.S. Navy, and it said, "The Navy needs you. Don't read American history, make it." So very appropriate since we're in American history class here. So you have the soldier telling this person, don't read about American history, come make it. Now, during the war, the military established or expanded a number of military bases in the San Antonio and El Paso regions because both have very warm and dry climates. Particularly, we're just starting with the Air Forces then. There was no U.S. Air Force. It was part of the Army at that point. But it was perfect for training pilots because, San Antonio has a very dry climate. There's a lot of area to the west of San Antonio that's not particularly populated. And to this very day, the U.S. Air Force conducts much of its pilot training in its bases in San Antonio. And they also trained many, many soldiers in Texas, which already had some Army bases, and those were expanded. And the Texas economy as a whole benefited because of this greatly increased federal military spending in the state. Now, because of the large German population in the state, which people feared, they've been good, loyal Texans and Americans to now, but, their ethnic identity may trump all that. And there was a lot of anti-German sentiment in the United States. There were some symbolic actions taken against Germans, and it wasn't just Texas. Throughout the United States, sauerkraut, the vegetable dish, was renamed Liberty cabbage in most restaurants throughout the U.S. Well, in Texas, Governor Hobby refused to appropriate funding for the German language department at the University of Texas. High schools throughout the state stopped teaching German language courses. The city of Brandenburg formally changed its name to Old Glory. Interesting. And some city councils formed vigilante groups, like groups of citizens who went out and kind of harassed German American communities. Would go out and scream at the German Americans, who weren't openly supporting Germany by any means, but because they were German. And it's interesting, the anti-German sentiment throughout the United States, and including Texas, really increased popularity of prohibition of alcohol because the major beer breweries in the United States were owned by Germans. And so somehow people felt that, drinking beer was un-American because it was produced by Germans. And even today, one of the major beer companies in the United States is Budweiser, a very German name. And the Germans traditionally had consumed a lot of beer. And finally, and this is the last slide, I'm sorry this lecture's lasting too long, looking at women's voting rights, it's interesting, in 1918, Annie Webb Blanton ran as a candidate for the superintendent of public instruction in Texas, and she won, and she was the first woman who ever was elected for a statewide office. And in 1919, Governor Hobby proposed a constitutional amendment that would allow women to vote in all elections, because women had been allowed to vote in only selected elections. And that was put on the May 1919 referendum ballot along with Prohibition. Well, it's interesting, Prohibition won, but women's suffrage lost. However, shortly thereafter, the next year, the U.S. Congress passed the amendment granting women the right to vote, which had to be ratified, of course, as an amendment by quarters of the states. So Governor Hobby immediately called a special session of Congress, and the Texas legislature was the first in the South to ratify the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. And in fact, Texas was one of the first 7 or 8 states to ratify the amendment. Okay, in the next lecture, we'll look at the 1920s, the so-called prosperity decade. I look forward to talking to you then. Thank you.